My name was Alexius Thane before the transformation, and I served a century and a half as a battle brother of the Imperial Fist's Third Company. They called it an honor, the highest honor any mortal could receive. To be chosen from among billions, to be reshaped by gene seed and ritual into one of the Emperor's angels of death. But honor is not what it felt like. What it felt like was erasure. Every implant, every hypno-indoctrination, every ritual stripped away another piece of the boy I had been and replaced it with something the chapter needed more. I was not being elevated above humanity. I was being carved out of it. The emotions, the ambitions, the ties to family and self, all of it was drowned beneath chemical conditioning and psychological rewriting until only fragments remained. The gene seed itself carried voices that were not mine, echoes of men long dead, instincts that did not belong to me but still whispered in my thoughts. My body became a weapon, my mind became a prison, and my soul became collateral in a war that has no end. This is what it means to wear the armor of the angels of death. What follows is not the story they tell in the scholar archives or the recruitment sermons. It is the truth of what it feels like to have your humanity unmade. I was 12 years old when the selection trials came to my hive, world of Mordian Prime. Like millions of other boys across the Imperium, I had grown up hearing stories of the Space Marines, tales of superhuman warriors who stood as humanity's protectors against alien threats and heretical corruption. In the education centers of the Mid-Hive, we learned the approved histories of the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, the endless campaigns where Space Marines had sacrificed themselves to preserve the Emperor's vision of human dominance across the galaxy. The stories painted pictures of noble warriors who retained their essential humanity while gaining the power to protect the innocent. We were told of Space Marines who remembered their families, who fought not just out of duty, but out of love for the people they protected. The propaganda spoke of enhanced humans who were still fundamentally human at their core, just better equipped to serve the Emperor's will. What the stories never mentioned was that these noble warriors were lies, propaganda designed to make the recruitment process more palatable to potential candidates and their families. The reality was that the transformation process would systematically destroy everything that made us human, replacing our individual identities with something that could serve as an efficient weapon, but could never again experience the emotions and connections that give life meaning. I was an exceptional candidate by any measure. I had scored perfectly on every academic assessment administered in my education block, demonstrated superior physical conditioning despite the nutritional limitations of mid-hive life, and shown the kind of unwavering loyalty to the Emperor that the selection criteria seemed to emphasize. My instructors had marked me as leadership material, someone who could potentially advance to positions of authority within the Imperial hierarchy. My family was proud when I volunteered for the selection trials. My father, a mid-level administratum clerk, saw my potential selection as vindication of our family's loyalty to the Imperium. My mother, despite her obvious concerns about the dangerous nature of Space Marine service, understood that being chosen would elevate our family's status within the hive's social structure. My younger sister, Elena, looked at me with a kind of hero worship that made me determined to prove worthy of her admiration. The selection process itself was presented as the ultimate test of worthiness, a series of trials that would identify those few individuals whose genetic structure was compatible with the sacred gene seed and whose psychological makeup could withstand the transformation process. Out of 10 million candidates on my world, perhaps 100 would be chosen for preliminary testing. Of those, maybe 10 would survive the initial compatibility screenings. Of those survivors, perhaps 1 or 2 would actually complete the transformation process and become full battle brothers. The odds were astronomical, but like every other boy who volunteered for testing, I believed I was special enough to succeed where millions of others had failed. The confidence of youth, combined with years of propaganda about Space Marine nobility, made me certain that I would not only survive the process, but emerge as one of the Emperor's chosen warriors with my essential self intact. The initial trials took place in a massive testing facility that had been constructed in the lower levels of our hive specifically for recruitment purposes. Thousands of candidates were processed through various examinations designed to test physical capability, mental resilience, genetic compatibility, and psychological stability. The facilities were impressive enough to reinforce our sense that we were participating in something important and noble, rather than being evaluated as potential raw materials for a weapons manufacturing process. The physical trials were brutal but comprehensible. We were tested for strength, endurance, pain tolerance, and recovery speed through exercises that pushed our 12-year-old bodies to their absolute limits. Many candidates were eliminated at this stage, but those of us who survived felt a sense of accomplishment and validation that we were indeed exceptional specimens worthy of further consideration. The psychological evaluations were more subtle but far more significant than we realized at the time. Teams of specialists administered tests that claimed to measure courage, loyalty, leadership potential, and emotional stability. What they were actually doing was identifying candidates whose psychological makeup could be most effectively modified through the conditioning process that would follow selection. They were looking for boys with strong emotional attachments that could be systematically severed, intellectual curiosity that could be redirected toward tactical applications, and individual ambitions that could be suppressed in favor of absolute obedience to chapter hierarchy. The ideal candidate wasn't someone who was naturally suited to be a space marine. It was someone whose natural human psychology could be most efficiently destroyed and rebuilt according to chapter specifications. The genetic testing was the most invasive and clinical aspect of the selection process. Extensive blood work, tissue sampling, and biological analysis determined whether our bodies could accommodate the 19 organ implantations that would transform us into something beyond human limitations. The apothecaries conducting these tests treated us like experimental subjects rather than potential warriors, their clinical detachment making it clear that our individual welfare was less important than our suitability for the transformation process. When the Imperial Fists recruiting party announced that I had been chosen for the next phase of testing, I felt like I had achieved the greatest honor possible for a human being. The ceremony was conducted with appropriate ritual and solemnity, emphasizing the sacred nature of the responsibility I was accepting and the glorious future that awaited me as one of the Emperor's chosen warriors. What I didn't understand was that the moment I accepted selection, Alexius Thane effectively ceased to exist. The boy who had volunteered for the trials, who loved his family and dreamed of serving the Emperor while retaining his essential humanity, was already dead. The creature that would eventually emerge from the transformation process would retain some of his memories and capabilities, but everything that had made him a unique individual would be systematically destroyed and replaced with something that could function as an efficient weapon. The transport vessel that carried me and the other selected candidates away from our home world was my first glimpse into the true nature of what we were becoming. The ship wasn't designed for human comfort or psychological well-being. It was a functional space designed to house potential weapons during their transport to processing facilities. The accommodations were Spartanly utilitarian, with no consideration for the emotional needs of boys who were leaving their families and everything they had ever known forever. We were housed in dormitory-style chambers that felt more like holding cells than living quarters, with no privacy, no personal possessions, and no opportunity for the kind of social interaction that might maintain our sense of individual identity. The ship's crew treated us with the same clinical detachment that the apothecaries had shown during selection. We weren't potential heroes being transported to our destinies. We were raw materials being moved to a manufacturing facility. The crew's attitude made it clear that our transformation was viewed as an industrial process rather than a sacred ritual, despite the religious terminology that surrounded the procedures. During the weeks-long journey to the Imperial Fists Fortress Monastery, I began to understand that the selection process had identified not just our physical and genetic suitability, but also our psychological vulnerabilities. The other boys who had been chosen showed similar patterns: strong family attachments, intellectual curiosity, personal ambitions that could be redirected toward chapter service, and the kind of emotional depth that would make the conditioning process more impactful. We were all exceptional individuals who could have made significant contributions to Imperial society in civilian roles. Scientists, administrators, military officers, artists, scholars. We represented the kind of human potential that should have been nurtured and developed rather than systematically destroyed. But the Space Marine creation process required exceptional raw materials, and our individual potential was viewed as something to be harvested rather than preserved. The journey provided ample time to form friendships with the other candidates, bonds that felt especially strong given our shared uncertainty about what awaited us at our destination. These friendships would become one of the first casualties of the transformation process, as the conditioning procedures were specifically designed to prevent the kind of emotional attachments that might create loyalty to individuals rather than absolute dedication to the chapter. As we approached the Imperial Fist's fortress monastery, I caught my first glimpse of the massive structure that would become my prison for the next several years. The fortress was an imposing construction that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome, its architecture emphasizing military function over any consideration for the psychological well-being of those who would live within its walls. The sight of the fortress made me realize that I was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Once I entered those walls, the boy who had volunteered for selection would begin a transformation that would destroy his essential humanity and replace it with something that could serve the chapter's needs, but could never again experience the emotions and connections that make life meaningful. The first hint that the transformation process might not be what I had expected came during the initial medical examinations within the fortress monastery. The procedures weren't just testing my physical condition. They were analyzing my psychological makeup with a thoroughness that suggested they were looking for specific mental characteristics that could be exploited or suppressed during the conditioning process. The apothecaries conducting the examinations approached me with the same clinical detachment that a tech priest might show when analyzing a piece of machinery. Their questions weren't designed to understand me as a person, but to catalog the various aspects of my personality that would need to be modified or eliminated to produce an effective Space Marine. When I spoke about my love for my younger sister Elena, the apothecary made notes about excessive emotional bonding that will require corrective conditioning. When I described my interest in studying Imperial history and technology, he recorded intellectual curiosity that must be channeled toward tactical applications. When I expressed my hope of one day serving as a chapter librarian, he noted aspirations that exceed designated role parameters. The psychological profiling continued for weeks, growing increasingly invasive as the apothecaries mapped every aspect of my personality, my fears, my desires, my fundamental sense of identity. They weren't just evaluating whether I was suitable for transformation. They were creating a detailed blueprint of everything about me that would need to be modified or eliminated to produce an effective Space Marine. The assessment process revealed the true nature of what I had volunteered for. I wasn't being prepared for enhancement. I was being analyzed for deconstruction. Every aspect of my personality that made me uniquely human was being identified as a potential weakness that would need to be addressed through the conditioning process. My capacity for emotional attachment was viewed as a liability that could create divided loyalties. My intellectual curiosity was seen as a distraction that could interfere with my focus on tactical objectives. My individual ambitions were considered a threat to the absolute obedience that the chapter demanded from its battle brothers. The apothecaries explained that the transformation process would not just give me superhuman capabilities. It would also optimize my psychological profile to eliminate traits that might interfere with my effectiveness as a weapon. They spoke of this optimization as if it were a beneficial adjustment rather than the systematic destruction of my individual identity. During this assessment phase, I began to meet some of the chapter's existing battle brothers, and their interactions with the candidates provided disturbing glimpses of what we were destined to become. These Marines showed no signs of the individual personality or emotional depth that characterized normal humans. They spoke only of duty, tactical considerations, and service to the chapter, as if they had no internal lives beyond their military functions. When I tried to engage them in conversations about their lives before transformation, their experiences during the process, or their feelings about their current existence, their responses were mechanical and devoid of genuine emotion. They spoke of their previous lives as if they were discussing historical events that had happened to other people with no apparent emotional connection to their former identities. These encounters made me realize that the transformation process didn't just enhance human capabilities, it fundamentally altered the nature of consciousness itself. The battle brothers I met had become something that was no longer recognizably human despite retaining human appearance and basic communication abilities. But by this point in the process, my psychological conditioning had already begun in subtle ways that made it difficult for me to fully process these realizations. The daily routine within the fortress monastery was designed to gradually break down my sense of individual identity and replace it with identification with the chapter collective. The actual beginning of the surgical transformation process came without ceremony or emotional acknowledgement of what was about to occur. I was simply informed that I had been accepted for gene seed implantation and that the procedures would begin immediately. There was no opportunity to contact my family, no chance to say goodbye to my previous life, no acknowledgement that I was about to undergo changes that would make it impossible for me to ever return to the person I had been. The first surgical procedure involved the implantation of the secondary heart, an additional organ that would provide redundancy for my cardiovascular system and enable my body to function even under conditions that would kill a normal human. The surgery itself was performed while I was conscious, the apothecaries explaining that my pain responses needed to be monitored to ensure proper integration of the new organ. The sensation of having a second heart implanted while fully aware defies adequate description. I could feel the foreign organ being connected to my circulatory system, the surgical implements working inside my chest cavity, the alien presence being permanently installed within my body. The physical pain was significant, but the psychological impact was far worse. My body no longer felt like it belonged to me. The secondary heart's rhythm was initially irregular and disturbing as it learned to coordinate with my primary heart. The sensation of having two hearts beating with slightly different rhythms created a constant awareness that I was no longer entirely human. The organ wasn't just providing enhanced cardiovascular capability, it was a permanent reminder that I had been transformed into something fundamentally different from what I had been. But the secondary heart was only the first of 19 separate organ implantations that would transform my physiology over the course of several years. Each new organ brought with it not just enhanced capabilities, but also psychological changes that gradually altered my perception of myself and my relationship to the world around me. The recovery period following the secondary heart implantation provided my first glimpse into the conditioning process that would accompany the physical transformation. While my body healed from the surgery, I underwent intensive hypnotherapy sessions designed to help me adapt to my new capabilities while beginning the systematic suppression of psychological traits that were deemed incompatible with Space Marine service. The hypnotherapy sessions were presented as medical treatment to help me adjust to the physical changes I was experiencing. In reality, they were the beginning of a comprehensive brainwashing process that would gradually erase my individual personality and replace it with psychological patterns that would make me an effective weapon. During these sessions, I was exposed to subliminal messaging that began to reshape my priorities and values. The importance of individual desires was downplayed while absolute dedication to the chapter was emphasized. The value of personal relationships was minimized while loyalty to battle brothers was elevated. My sense of individual identity was gradually eroded while identification with the Imperial Fists Collective was strengthened. The chemical treatments that accompanied the hypnotherapy were designed to make my brain more receptive to the conditioning while suppressing emotional responses that might resist the process. These treatments didn't just affect my immediate mental state, they began to permanently alter my brain chemistry in ways that would make it increasingly difficult to maintain my original personality. The second organ implantation involved the ossis modula, the biological system responsible for strengthening and enhancing my skeletal structure. This procedure was even more invasive than the secondary heart implantation, requiring modifications to my existing bone structure while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my physical capabilities. The ossis modula that strengthened my skeletal structure made my bones feel unnaturally heavy and dense, changing the way I moved and interacted with my environment. The enhanced bone density wasn't just a physical modification. It created a constant awareness that my body was becoming something inhuman, something designed for warfare rather than normal human experience. The psychological impact of feeling my skeleton transform was profound. Every movement reminded me that I was no longer the same species as the family I had left behind. My enhanced bone structure made me stronger and more resistant to injury, but it also created a physical barrier between myself and normal human experience that could never be crossed again. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the os modula implantation focused on teaching me to think of my body as a weapon, rather than as the vessel for my consciousness. The enhanced physical capabilities were presented not as improvements to my quality of life, but as tools that existed solely to serve the chapter's military objectives. During this phase of the transformation, I began to lose my ability to find a pleasure in simple physical activities that had once brought me joy. Running, climbing, playing games, all of these activities felt different when performed with my enhanced skeletal structure. The superhuman capabilities made normal human physical activities feel inadequate and pointless. The os modula also introduced the first of the biological systems that would operate independently of my conscious control. The organ regulated my bone density and structure automatically, making decisions about my physical development based on chemical signals and genetic programming rather than my personal preferences or desires. This loss of conscious control over my own physical development was psychologically devastating in ways I couldn't fully understand at the time. My body was becoming something that operated according to its own biological imperatives, rather than responding to my conscious will, making me feel like a passenger in my own flesh, rather than its rightful occupant. The third organ implantation involved the biscopia, the biological system responsible for enhancing my muscle development beyond normal human limitations. This procedure involved not just the insertion of new biological components, but also modifications to my existing muscle tissue that would fundamentally alter my physical capabilities and my relationship with my own body. The biscopia that enhanced my muscle development created a constant sensation of physical tension and readiness for violence that made peaceful activities feel uncomfortable and unnatural. The enhanced muscle tissue didn't just provide increased strength. It created a state of perpetual physical alertness that made it difficult to relax or find peace in quiet moments. The psychological impact of this constant physical tension was devastating to my mental well-being. I found it increasingly difficult to engage in activities that required calm focus or peaceful contemplation. Reading, meditation, artistic pursuits, all of these activities became uncomfortable because my enhanced musculature created a persistent sense that I should be engaged in physical activity or combat preparation. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the biscopia implantation focused on channeling my enhanced physical capabilities toward aggressive applications, rather than helping me learn to control my new strength in ways that would allow me to interact safely with normal humans. The training emphasized combat effectiveness and the application of force in military situations. This training approach created a fundamental problem that would persist throughout my existence as a space marine. My enhanced physical capabilities made me dangerous to normal humans, even during casual interactions, but the conditioning process provided no guidance for managing this danger except through complete avoidance of civilian contact. The biscopia also introduced changes to my metabolic requirements that further separated me from normal human experience. My enhanced muscle tissue required significantly more nutritional support than normal human physiology, but it also allowed me to derive energy from sources that would be inadequate or harmful to ordinary people. These metabolic changes meant that I could no longer share meals with normal humans without being constantly aware that our biological needs were fundamentally different. The simple human pleasure of sharing food with family or friends became impossible because my enhanced physiology had different requirements and capabilities than normal human biology. The fourth organ implantation involved the hemastamen, the biological system responsible for enhancing my blood chemistry and improving my bodies to transport oxygen and nutrients to my enhanced organ systems. This procedure required modifications to my existing circulatory system while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my blood composition. The hemastamen that improved my blood chemistry enhanced my healing capabilities, but also made me hyper-aware of injuries and physical sensations in ways that were constantly distracting. Every minor cut or bruise became a significant sensory experience as my enhanced blood chemistry responded to damage with increased efficiency, but also increased sensitivity. The psychological impact of this enhanced injury awareness was significant. I found it difficult to ignore minor physical discomfort that normal humans would dismiss without conscious thought. Every small injury became a reminder that my body was operating according to enhanced biological systems that were fundamentally different from normal human physiology. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the hemastamen implantation focused on teaching me to interpret pain and injury in tactical terms rather than as personal experiences requiring emotional responses. Pain became information about my operational status rather than a signal that I needed care and comfort. This reframing of pain and injury had profound psychological consequences that extended far beyond physical sensation. The ability to experience pain is fundamentally connected to human empathy and emotional processing. By teaching me to treat pain as tactical data rather than as a meaningful experience, the conditioning process was systematically eroding my capacity for emotional connection with others. The hemastamen also introduced changes to my blood chemistry that made me effectively immune to many toxins and diseases that could affect normal humans. While this enhanced resistance was tactically valuable, it also created another barrier between myself and normal human experience. I could no longer share the common human experience of illness or the vulnerability that comes with susceptibility to environmental hazards. This immunity made me safer in combat situations, but it also made it impossible for me to empathize with the fears and concerns that motivated much of normal human behavior. The fifth organ implantation involved the Larraman's organ, the biological system responsible for providing rapid blood clotting and accelerated wound healing. This procedure introduced new biological components that would fundamentally alter my body's response to injury and damage. The Larraman's organ that provided rapid clotting made even minor cuts feel like significant medical events, my enhanced nervous system overreacting to damage that would have been trivial for a normal human. The organ's response to injury was so efficient that it often sealed wounds before I could properly assess their severity, creating a disconnect between the actual damage and my sensory experience of it. The psychological impact of this enhanced healing capability was more significant than I had anticipated. The knowledge that I could survive injuries that would kill normal humans fundamentally altered my relationship with physical risk and mortality. The fear of death that motivates much of human behavior was replaced with a clinical awareness of damage states and recovery possibilities. This change in my relationship with mortality made it increasingly difficult to understand why normal humans were so concerned with physical safety and injury prevention. Their fears seemed irrationally exaggerated from my enhanced perspective, creating a psychological barrier that made it difficult to empathize with the civilians I was supposedly being trained to protect. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the Larraman's organ implantation focused on exploiting my enhanced healing capabilities for tactical advantage, rather than helping me maintain connection with human vulnerability. I was taught to use my rapid healing as a combat resource, rather than as a gift that should increase my appreciation for life. The Larraman's organ also introduced the first of the biological systems that would operate with apparent intelligence of its own. The organ seemed to make decisions about wound treatment based on criteria that I couldn't consciously access, prioritizing healing based on tactical considerations rather than my personal comfort or preferences. This sense that my own body was making decisions about my welfare based on programming that I couldn't control was psychologically disturbing. I was becoming less like a person with enhanced capabilities and more like a biological machine programmed to optimize its own operational status according to external criteria. The sixth organ implantation involved the catalepsean node, the biological system that would control my sleep cycles and allow me to remain functional with minimal rest. This procedure marked a crucial turning point in the transformation process, as it would fundamentally alter my relationship with consciousness itself. The implantation of the catalepsean node was more invasive than the previous procedures, requiring direct modifications to my brain tissue and nervous system. The surgery was performed while I was conscious, allowing the apothecaries to monitor my neurological responses and ensure proper integration of the new organ with my existing brain structures. The sensation of having foreign tissue implanted directly into my brain was unlike anything I had experienced during the previous surgeries. I could feel the alien presence being integrated into my consciousness, the new organ establishing connections with my existing neural pathways. The procedure felt like a violation of my mind in ways that the previous physical modifications had not achieved. The catalepsean node didn't just reduce my need for sleep. It fundamentally altered my relationship with consciousness itself, creating a state of perpetual alertness that made normal human experiences of rest and dreams impossible. The organ allowed me to enter a state of partial consciousness that provided some recovery benefits, but it eliminated the deep, restorative sleep that allows normal humans to process emotions and consolidate memories. Without the restorative function of natural sleep, my mind began to rely increasingly on the artificial mental structures that had been implanted through the conditioning process. The hypno-indoctrinated responses and behavioral patterns became more dominant as my original personality lacked the opportunity to reassert itself through the unconscious processing that occurs during normal sleep cycles. The psychological impact of losing the ability to dream was devastating in ways I couldn't fully understand at the time. Dreams serve crucial functions in human psychology, providing opportunities for emotional processing, creative thinking, and the integration of daily experiences into long-term memory. Without access to these natural psychological processes, my mind became increasingly dependent on the artificial mental structures imposed through conditioning. The catalepsean node also introduced a form of consciousness that felt fundamentally alien to human experience. The partial awareness state that replaced normal sleep was neither fully conscious nor truly unconscious. It was a liminal state that felt like being trapped between waking and sleeping without access to the benefits of either condition. During these partial consciousness periods, I became increasingly aware of the other artificial mental structures that had been implanted through the conditioning process. Without the natural psychological reset that comes with normal sleep, the hypno-indoctrinated responses became increasingly dominant in my thinking patterns. The seventh organ implantation involved the preomnor, the pre-digestive stomach that would allow me to extract nutritional value from substances that would be toxic to normal humans. This procedure required extensive modifications to my existing digestive system while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my relationship with food and nutrition. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the transformation was the implantation of the preomnor, the pre-digestive stomach that allowed me to extract nutritional value from substances that would be toxic to normal humans. The organ enabled me to survive in hostile environments by consuming materials that would kill ordinary people, but it also created a fundamental barrier between myself and normal human experience. The preomnor didn't just provide enhanced digestive capabilities. It fundamentally altered my relationship with food and eating in ways that made normal human social activities impossible. I could no longer share meals with ordinary humans without being constantly aware that my digestive processes were fundamentally different from theirs. Food that normal humans found nourishing might be inadequate for my enhanced metabolism, while substances that would poison them could provide sustenance for me. The simple human pleasure of sharing a meal became impossible because my biological needs were no longer compatible with normal human physiology. The psychological impact of this digestive enhancement extended far beyond nutrition. Sharing food is one of the most fundamental human social activities, a way of expressing care, building relationships, and maintaining cultural connections. The Preomnor made it impossible for me to participate in these essential human experiences. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the Preomnor implantation focused on teaching me to view food purely as fuel for my enhanced biology, rather than as a source of pleasure or social connection. This utilitarian approach to nutrition eliminated another avenue for maintaining connection with my human origins. The Preomnor also introduced digestive processes that operated largely outside my conscious control. The organ made decisions about which substances to process and how to extract nutrients based on its own biological programming rather than my taste preferences or conscious choices about what to eat. This loss of conscious control over such a basic biological function was psychologically disturbing. Eating became a mechanical process designed to maintain my operational status rather than an enjoyable activity that could provide pleasure and social connection. The eighth organ implantation involved the multi-lung, the enhanced respiratory system that would provide improved oxygen processing and the ability to survive in hostile atmospheric conditions. This procedure required modifications to my existing lung capacity while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my breathing patterns. The multi-lung that provided enhanced respiratory efficiency in hostile atmospheres made breathing feel like a conscious mechanical process rather than a natural biological function. The awareness of having multiple respiratory systems operating in coordination created a persistent sense of being a machine rather than a living creature. The enhanced respiratory capability provided by the multi-lung was tactically valuable, allowing me to survive in environments that would kill normal humans. But the psychological cost was significant. Breathing became a conscious process that required constant awareness of my enhanced biological systems. The multi-lung also introduced breathing patterns that were noticeably different from normal human respiration. The enhanced oxygen processing created rhythms and depths of breath that would be immediately recognizable as inhuman to anyone familiar with normal human physiology. This meant that I could never again blend seamlessly into human populations, even during peaceful interactions. My breathing patterns alone would mark me as something fundamentally different from normal humans, creating a constant reminder of my transformed status. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the multi-lung implantation focused on optimizing my respiratory function for combat environments, rather than helping me maintain any connection to normal human breathing patterns. The training emphasized efficiency and tactical advantage over any consideration for my psychological comfort or social needs. The ninth organ implantation involved the oculobe, the enhanced visual system that would provide superhuman sight capabilities far beyond the normal human limitations. This procedure required modifications to my existing eye structure while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my perception of the world around me. The oculobe that enhanced my visual capabilities to superhuman levels made normal human environments feel dim and poorly designed. My enhanced vision could detect details and environmental factors that were invisible to normal humans. But this constant flow of additional sensory information made it difficult to focus on peaceful activities or appreciate simple beauty. The enhanced visual capabilities provided by the oculobe allowed me to see in low light conditions, detect minute details at extreme distances, and perceive visual spectra beyond normal human range. These capabilities were tactically valuable, but they also created a sensory experience that was fundamentally different from normal human vision. The psychological impact of enhanced vision was more significant than I had anticipated. The ability to see details that normal humans couldn't perceive created a constant awareness of information and stimuli that made peaceful contemplation difficult. Every environment became a tactical assessment rather than a place that could provide comfort or beauty. The oculobe also changed my perception of other humans in ways that were psychologically disturbing. I could see details of their physiology, health status, and emotional state that they weren't aware of themselves. This enhanced perception made normal human interactions feel clinical and analytical rather than genuine social connections. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the oculobe implantation focused on channeling my enhanced visual capabilities toward tactical applications rather than helping me maintain appreciation for beauty or peaceful visual experiences. The training emphasized threat assessment and environmental analysis over any consideration for aesthetic pleasure or emotional response to visual stimuli. The 10th organ implantation involved the liman's ear, the enhanced auditory system that would provide superhuman hearing capabilities and improved balance. This procedure required modifications to my existing ear structure while introducing new biological components that would fundamentally alter my perception of sound and spatial awareness. The liman's ear that improved my hearing and balance to superhuman levels made normal human conversations feel inadequate and imprecise. I could detect subtle vocal inflections, heartbeat patterns, and environmental sounds that revealed information normal humans couldn't access. But this enhanced awareness made social interactions feel clinical and analytical rather than genuine human connections. The enhanced auditory capabilities provided by the liman's ear allowed me to hear sounds across extended frequency ranges, detect minute audio details, and maintain perfect balance even in disorienting conditions. These capabilities were useful for combat and tactical situations, but they also created an auditory experience that was fundamentally different from normal human hearing. The psychological impact of enhanced hearing was devastating to my social interactions. I could hear the subtle changes in heartbeat, breathing patterns, and vocal stress that indicated when people were lying, afraid, or emotionally distressed. This information made it impossible to maintain naive trust or emotional connection with others. Every conversation became an exercise in data analysis rather than genuine communication. I could detect information about people's emotional states and intentions that they weren't consciously sharing, creating a barrier to authentic relationship that could never be overcome. The liman's ear also provided balance and spatial awareness capabilities that were far beyond normal human range. While these capabilities were tactically valuable, they also created a constant awareness of my physical environment that made it difficult to relax or find peace in quiet moments. The 11th organ implantation involved the Susan membrane, the biological system that would allow me to enter a state of suspended animation when critically injured. This procedure introduced one of the most psychologically disturbing capabilities of the Space Marine transformation. The Susan membrane allowed me to enter a state of suspended animation when critically injured. But the knowledge that I could survive wounds that would kill normal humans created a fundamental change in my relationship with mortality and physical risk that was psychologically devastating. The fear of death that motivates much of human behavior was replaced with a clinical awareness of damage states and recovery possibilities that made it difficult to understand why normal humans were so concerned with physical safety. This psychological shift made it increasingly difficult to empathize with the civilians I was supposed to protect, whose concerns about injury and death seemed irrationally exaggerated from my enhanced perspective. The Susan membrane also introduced the possibility of extended periods of suspended consciousness that were neither life nor death, but something fundamentally different from normal human experience. The knowledge that I might spend extended periods in this liminal state created a form of existential dread that normal humans never have to confront. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the Susan membrane implantation focused on teaching me to view suspended animation as a tactical resource rather than as a traumatic experience. This clinical approach to near-death states further eroded my connection to normal human concerns about mortality and vulnerability. The 12th organ implantation involved the melanchromic organ, the biological system that would control my skin pigmentation in response to radiation levels and environmental conditions. This procedure introduced capabilities that created a fundamental disconnect from my physical appearance and identity. The melanchromic organ that controlled my skin pigmentation in response to radiation levels made me constantly aware that my body was no longer entirely human. The ability to consciously alter my physical appearance, even in minor ways, created a persistent sense of disconnection from my biological form that made it difficult to maintain any sense of consistent identity. The psychological impact of having conscious control over my skin pigmentation was more disturbing than I had anticipated. Physical appearance is fundamental to human identity and self-recognition. When your appearance can change based on environmental conditions or conscious control, it becomes difficult to maintain a stable sense of who you are. The melanchromic organ also served as a constant reminder that my body was designed for warfare rather than normal human experience. The ability to alter my skin pigmentation was tactically useful for camouflage and protection against radiation, but it also meant that my physical form was optimized for combat rather than social interaction or personal comfort. The conditioning sessions that accompanied the melanchromic organ implantation focused on tactical applications of the pigmentation control rather than helping me maintain any sense of consistent physical identity. The training emphasized camouflage and environmental adaptation over any consideration for my psychological need for stable self-image. The 13th organ implantation involved the oolitic kidney, the enhanced filtration system that would allow me to survive on minimal water while filtering toxins from my system. This procedure introduced biological capabilities that further separated me from normal human physiology and experience. The oolitic kidney that allowed me to survive on minimal water while filtering toxins from my system enhanced my physical resilience, but also made me hyper-aware of my body's biological processes in ways that were constantly distracting. Every meal, every drink, every breath became a conscious experience of enhanced metabolic function that reminded me that I was no longer the same species as the humans I was supposed to protect. The enhanced filtration capabilities provided by the oolitic kidney allowed me to survive in environments that would quickly kill normal humans through dehydration or toxic exposure. These capabilities were tactically valuable, but they also created biological processes that were fundamentally different from normal human physiology. The psychological impact of enhanced kidney function was significant because it affected such basic biological needs as water consumption and waste processing. These fundamental biological functions became conscious processes that required awareness of my enhanced capabilities rather than unconscious biological activities that could be taken for granted. The oolitic kidney also introduced metabolic processes that operated independently of my conscious control, making decisions about resource allocation and toxin filtering based on its own biological programming rather than my personal preferences or comfort. The 14th organ implantation involved the neuroglottis, the enhanced taste and smell system that would provide superhuman chemical detection capabilities. This procedure introduced sensory capabilities that would fundamentally alter my perception of food, environment, and other people. The neuroglottis that enhanced my taste and smell capabilities to superhuman levels made normal human environments feel overwhelming and unpleasant. The enhanced sensory input was useful for detecting enemies and environmental hazards, but it also made peaceful settings feel artificial and uncomfortable. I could no longer enjoy simple pleasures like food or pleasant scents, because my enhanced senses detected chemical compositions and biological processes that normal humans couldn't perceive. The enhanced chemical detection capabilities provided by the neuroglottis allowed me to identify toxins, explosives, biological threats, and human emotional states through scent analysis. These capabilities were tactically valuable, but they also created a sensory experience that was fundamentally different from normal human taste and smell. The psychological impact of enhanced chemical detection was devastating to my social interactions. I could detect fear, arousal, illness, deception, and other emotional and physical states in other people through their chemical signatures. This information made it impossible to maintain naive social interactions or emotional connections. Every human interaction became an exercise in chemical analysis rather than genuine communication, I could detect information about people's health, emotional state, and intentions that they weren't consciously sharing, creating another barrier to authentic relationship that could never be overcome. The neuroglottis also made eating and drinking experiences fundamentally different from normal human enjoyment of food. Instead of experiencing taste and smell as sources of pleasure, I experienced them as information about chemical composition, nutritional value, and potential threats. The 15th organ implantation involved the mucranoid, the biological system that would allow me to secrete protective substances through my skin. This procedure introduced capabilities that further alienated me from normal human physical experience. The mucranoid that allowed me to secrete a protective waxy substance made my skin feel constantly foreign and unnatural. The ability to consciously control this secretion required constant awareness of my body's defensive systems that made it impossible to ever feel truly relaxed or at peace. The protective secretions provided by the mucranoid were tactically valuable for surviving in hostile environments, but they also created a physical barrier between myself and normal human contact. The substances my skin could produce would be toxic or uncomfortable for normal humans, making casual physical contact dangerous for others. This meant that I could never again experience simple human pleasures like friendly touch, embraces, or other forms of physical affection without being aware that my body posed a potential threat to others. Even casual contact could expose normal humans to substances that their biology couldn't process safely. The mucranoid also introduced another biological system that operated largely outside my conscious control, making decisions about protective secretions based on environmental analysis rather than my personal preferences or social needs. The 16th organ implantation involved the Becher's gland, the biological system that would allow me to produce and spit corrosive substances. This procedure introduced one of the most obviously inhuman capabilities of the Space Marine transformation. The Becher's gland that allowed me to produce corrosive saliva created perhaps the most obvious reminder that I was no longer human. The ability to consciously produce substances that could dissolve metal made every act of speaking, eating, or drinking a potential weapon deployment rather than a normal biological function. The psychological impact of having corrosive saliva was devastating to any remaining sense of normal human identity. The knowledge that my mouth contained substances that could cause serious injury to others made every social interaction a potential threat situation that required constant conscious control. The Becher's gland also affected my ability to enjoy food and drink in normal human ways. The corrosive substances in my saliva changed the taste and texture of everything I consumed, making it impossible to share the simple human pleasure of enjoying meals. The capability to produce acid also served as a constant reminder that my body was designed as a weapon rather than as a vessel for consciousness and social interaction. Every biological function had been modified to serve tactical purposes rather than to provide pleasure or comfort. The 17th and 18th organ implantations involved the progenoid glands, the biological systems responsible for producing and maintaining the gene seed that would eventually be harvested to create future space marines. These procedures introduced perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire transformation process. The progenoid glands that produced gene seed created a biological connection to every previous warrior who had carried the same genetic material. Through these organs, I began to experience memories and psychological influences that belonged to Marines who had died decades or centuries before my birth. The gene seed carried within it not just genetic information, but also psychological imprints and memory fragments from its previous hosts. As the progenoids matured, I found myself experiencing flashes of alien memory, glimpses of battles I had never fought, tactical knowledge I had never learned, emotional responses to situations I had never encountered. These inherited psychological patterns created a constant internal struggle between my original personality, what little remained of it, and the accumulated experiences of the gene seed's previous bearers. I might find myself reacting to situations based on traumatic experiences that belonged to Marines who had died long before I was born, or making tactical decisions based on battlefield knowledge that I had never personally acquired. The chapter's command structure recognized and exploited this psychological fragmentation, using it to ensure that individual Marines remained focused on their assigned roles rather than developing personal agendas that might conflict with the chapter's objectives. We were encouraged to think of ourselves as temporary custodians of the gene seed, rather than individuals with our own identities and purposes. The progenoids also served as a constant reminder that my transformed body was not truly my own. It was a vessel for genetic material that belonged to the chapter and would eventually be harvested to create future warriors. My individual existence was temporary and expendable, valuable only as long as it could protect and nurture the gene seed for future extraction. The 19th and final organ implantation involved the black carapace, the neural interface system that would allow me to merge consciousness with power armor and other Imperial technology. This procedure marked the completion of my transformation from human being to living weapon. The transformation process culminated with the implantation of the black carapace, the final organ that would allow me to interface directly with power armor systems. The surgical procedure required the insertion of neural interface ports throughout my body, creating direct connections between my nervous system and the machine spirits of Imperial technology. The psychological impact of having mechanical interfaces permanently installed in my body was devastating in ways that the previous organ implantations had not prepared me for. The ports weren't just surgical additions, they were permanent reminders that I had been transformed into something that was more machine than human, designed to interface with equipment rather than exist as an independent biological entity. When I was finally fitted with my power armor for the first time, the sensation of having my consciousness merge with the machine spirit of the suit was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. The armor's systems became extensions of my own body, its sensors providing enhanced awareness of my environment, its strength amplifiers making me capable of feats that would have been impossible for any unenhanced human. But the union with the machine spirit also created a fundamental change in my sense of identity. When connected to the armor, I felt more like a weapon system than a person, my consciousness becoming part of a larger mechanical entity whose purposes and priorities were determined by its programming rather than my personal desires or decisions. The black carapace also marked the completion of my psychological conditioning. By this point in the process, enough of my original personality had been suppressed or eliminated that I no longer experienced the neural interface as a violation of my humanity. Instead, I experienced it as the natural completion of my transformation into something that could serve the chapter more effectively. The decades of service that followed my transformation provided ample opportunity to understand the full implications of what I had become. As a space marine, I was capable of surviving environments that would kill normal humans, fighting enemies that would overwhelm conventional forces, and accomplishing military objectives that would be impossible for ordinary soldiers. But these capabilities came at the cost of everything that had made me human. I could no longer form meaningful emotional connections with other people, whether fellow space marines or the civilians we protected. My enhanced physiology made normal human pleasures and comforts feel inadequate or unpleasant. My psychological conditioning made it impossible to question orders or pursue personal interests that didn't serve the chapter's objectives. The constant warfare that defined Space Marine existence provided no opportunity for psychological recovery or personal development. Each campaign brought new traumas, new experiences of violence and death that were added to the accumulated psychological burden carried by the gene seed. The enhanced memory capabilities that came with our transformation meant that nothing was ever forgotten. Every battle, every casualty, every moment of horror was preserved with perfect clarity that made psychological healing impossible. The superhuman physical capabilities that made us effective warriors also created a fundamental barrier between ourselves and the humanity we were supposed to protect. Our enhanced strength meant that we could accidentally injure or kill normal humans through casual physical contact. Our modified metabolism meant that we couldn't share food or drink with ordinary people. Our altered sleep cycles meant that we couldn't participate in normal human social activities. The psychological conditioning that made us effective soldiers also made it impossible for us to relate to civilian concerns and motivations. The priorities that drove normal human behavior, family relationships, personal ambitions, simple pleasures, seemed irrelevant and incomprehensible from our perspective. We could protect humanity, but we could never again be part of it. The centuries of service stretched ahead with the promise of nothing but continued warfare, continued psychological deterioration, and continued isolation from everything that makes existence meaningful beyond simple survival and duty. The enhanced lifespan that came with our transformation wasn't a gift. It was a curse that trapped us in a state of perpetual psychological limbo, too changed to be human, but too aware to be mere weapons. One of the most disturbing aspects of Space Marine existence that the recruitment propaganda never mentions is the way the gene seed carries psychological imprints from its previous hosts. As the years passed and my progenoid glands matured, I found myself experiencing memories and emotional responses that belonged to other Marines who had carried the same genetic material decades or centuries before my birth. These inherited psychological patterns weren't just random mental noise. They were complete emotional and sensory experiences that felt as real and immediate as my own memories. I might suddenly experience the terror of a Marine who had been consumed by tyrannids, the rage of a warrior who had watched his battle brothers die to chaos corruption, or the despair of a veteran who had witnessed the failure of a critical mission. The worst part of these inherited memories was that they came with full emotional impact, as if I had personally experienced the traumatic events they contained. The gene seed didn't just carry genetic information, it carried psychological trauma that accumulated across generations of warriors, creating an ever-growing burden of inherited suffering that each new Marine had to bear. The chapter's chaplains claimed that these inherited memories were gifts that provided tactical knowledge and battlefield wisdom from previous generations. In reality, they were a form of psychological torture that forced each new Marine to experience the accumulated trauma of every warrior who had previously carried the gene seed. The inherited memories also made it impossible to develop a stable sense of personal identity. When your consciousness contains the experiences of dozens of previous warriors, it becomes difficult to distinguish between your own thoughts and emotions and those that belong to the genetic legacy you carry. I found myself making decisions based on tactical knowledge I had never personally acquired, responding to threats with emotional reactions that belonged to Marines who had died before I was born. The social dynamics within a Space Marine chapter create another layer of psychological torment that is rarely discussed in recruitment materials. While battle brothers are supposed to form bonds of loyalty and mutual support, the reality is that the conditioning process makes genuine emotional connection impossible. Space Marines can work together effectively as a tactical unit, but they cannot form the kind of meaningful relationships that provide psychological support and emotional fulfillment. The suppression of emotional capacity that makes us effective weapons also makes us incapable of the empathy and vulnerability that genuine friendship requires. The hierarchical structure of the chapter compounds this isolation by creating relationships based purely on rank and tactical necessity rather than personal affinity or mutual care. Battle brothers may serve together for decades without ever developing more than a professional understanding of each other's capabilities and tactical preferences. The veteran Marines who survived multiple centuries of service showed the psychological toll of this isolation. They moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency, but they displayed no signs of joy, curiosity, or emotional engagement with their existence. They had become living weapons that retained human intelligence but had lost everything that makes consciousness worth having. The chapter's rituals and traditions were designed to create artificial bonds that could substitute for genuine emotional connection, but these manufactured relationships provided no real psychological support. The formal brotherhood of the chapter was a poor substitute for the authentic human relationships that had been systematically eliminated through the conditioning process. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Space Marine service is the constant exposure to the normal human life that we were supposed to protect, but could never again experience or understand. Every deployment to defend civilian populations served as a reminder of everything we had lost through our transformation. Watching normal humans live their lives, forming families, pursuing personal interests, experiencing simple pleasures, building communities based on emotional connection rather than tactical necessity, created a constant awareness of the humanity that had been stripped away from us. We could protect these people, but we could never again share their experiences or understand their motivations. The civilians we protected viewed us with a mixture of awe and fear that made genuine interaction impossible. They recognized us as superhuman protectors, but they also sensed that we were no longer truly human. Their reactions to our presence reinforced our awareness that we had become something alien to the species we were supposed to serve. The disconnect between our capabilities and our psychological limitations created constant tactical and strategic problems. We could analyze threats and develop military solutions with superhuman efficiency, but we couldn't understand human motivations well enough to predict civilian behavior or develop strategies that accounted for human psychological needs. This meant that our protection often came at the cost of destroying the very communities and social structures that gave civilian life meaning. We could keep people alive, but we couldn't preserve the relationships and cultural patterns that made their lives worth living. After a century and a half of service as a Space Marine, I finally understood the true nature of what I had become. The transformation process hadn't enhanced my humanity. It had systematically destroyed everything human about me and replaced it with a biological weapon that retained just enough consciousness to be aware of what it had lost. The recruitment propaganda speaks of honor and glory, of serving as humanity's protectors and the Emperor's chosen warriors. But the reality of Space Marine existence is a living hell of psychological isolation, biological alienation, and spiritual emptiness that makes death in battle seem like mercy rather than sacrifice. We are not enhanced humans. We are the animated corpses of the boys who volunteered for transformation, our consciousness trapped within biological systems that were designed to serve the Imperium's military needs rather than to provide meaningful existence for the minds imprisoned within them. The greatest tragedy of Space Marine existence is not the constant warfare or the certainty of eventual death in battle. It's the knowledge that the person you were before the transformation is gone forever, replaced by something that can never experience the simple human pleasures and connections that make life worth living. The Alexius Thane who volunteered for selection died during the first surgical procedure. What emerged from the transformation process was a biological weapon that retained fragments of his memories and capabilities, but none of his essential humanity. The Space Marine called Alexius Thane was a pale imitation of the boy who had once dreamed of serving the Emperor while preserving his connection to family and human community. This is what they don't tell you when they offer you the chance to become a Space Marine. The transformation destroys everything you are and replaces it with something that serves the Imperium's needs rather than your own. You gain superhuman capabilities, but you lose your humanity. You become a perfect warrior, but you cease to be a person. If you are ever offered the chance to become a Space Marine, understand what you are truly accepting. You are not being honored. You are being sacrificed, your individual identity destroyed to create a weapon for the Imperium's use. The boy who enters the transformation process will die as surely as if he had been killed in battle, replaced by something that retains only fragments of his original consciousness. The Emperor protects, they say. But sometimes the greatest protection he can offer is to spare you from the honor of serving as one of his angels of death. Choose mortality over transformation. Choose humanity over superhuman capability. Choose the brief, meaningful existence of a normal human life over the endless, empty existence of a Space Marine. This is my warning, transmitted in violation of my sacred oaths, but in service of a greater truth that potential recruits deserve to understand. Remember Alexius Thane not as the Space Marine he became, but as the boy who was sacrificed to create that weapon. In the Emperor's name, choose life over service, humanity over honor, mortality over the living death of transformation into something that can never again experience what it means to be truly human.